Hey folks, BlackCross here, and welcome to I guess you could call it a review regardless, but I wanted to talk about my thoughts of one particular game, but I figured, let's just go ahead and talk about both games technically, seeing as how, number one, they are technical new releases, but new releases of a previously known title, known as No More Heroes, more specifically, No More Heroes 1 and 2 for Nintendo Switch. I want to talk about my experiences with both of them, as well as considering the fact that I've never played the second one, and now that I finally played it, I want to go ahead and give my overall thoughts while they're fresh in my mind. Which is weird considering the fact that, I just got done doing a review of Ghost of Tsushima, and here I am doing a review on No More Heroes 1 and 2. So it's like, wow, you're on a roll, BlackCross. Well, considering the fact that I've been quarantining and stuff, got nothing better to do. Playing video games is what I do, so naturally I've had a lot of time. So I want to go ahead and first start off with talking about No More Heroes 1. If you know, technically on my Let's Play channel known as BlackCross Favorite Games, I specifically stated that No More Heroes for the PlayStation 3 was the one that I played, and I loved that version. However, though, I wanted to go ahead and try out No More Heroes for the Switch, just to see if there was any improvements and stuff, especially considering the fact that I wanted a Switch version of No More Heroes anyway. And I have to say, technically in terms of the Switch version, technically it's a re-release, a remaster of the Wii version rather than the PlayStation 3 version. It's kind of weird considering the fact that, it was released for the PlayStation 3. You would think that the Wii version would have the PS3 version, but it doesn't. Instead, it's taken from the Wii version. So it was definitely a weird thing, finding out that, hey, this is not the Heroes Paradise version, this is the regular version. But even knowing that factor alone, I have to say, I was very impressed with how they fixed everything for controller only, and have it to where the option is that, yes, you can still do motion controls should you desire to, but there's a separate option in which where you can just use just the controller base only. And I cannot stress that enough. I'm so glad that they did that. Everything does not have to be motion. The PlayStation 3 technically had motion of some form. It was just to charge the beam katana. But in this case, you don't have to. Instead, the way to charge your beam katana is to hold the R button followed by shaking the right analog stick to charge the beam katana, and I am so glad that is just the option instead of some random bullshit motion control thing. Because No More Heroes was created during the Wii era, which means it was built around the ideal of motion controls. And I mean, the game is great on its own, but it didn't have to be made around motion controls, But thankfully they fixed it up to where now it can be run with normal controls. And it works really well in this first one. I'm so glad. And I have to say, I think I would prefer to go for this one, prefer to the PlayStation 3. Occasionally I might go for the PlayStation 3 just to re-experience those extra bosses. But technically those extra bosses are seen in Desperate Struggles. So, in other words, it doesn't really matter. So technically I have nothing but positive feedback on the first one. However, though, moving on to the second one, that's where things gets a little bit tricky. So let's go ahead and just address the elephant in the room first when it comes to No More Heroes, which is of course the bosses. The bosses in which where, you fight the 50 ranks of assassins in this case. However, though, they're not exactly 50 assassins to kill, because one of them is technically a 25 horde groupie that forged into a giant robot. You think this is crazy, but this is Pseudo 51 we're talking about. You see some abnormal stuff anyway. I mean, if you played Killer 7 and then Killer is Dead, chances are you've already been experienced with the insanity that is Pseudo 51. So, in other words, this isn't that far of a stretch, but at the same time, it was like, this is kind of a weird way to do some assassinations, but whatever. So you jump from, like, I believe it was at 49th to 25 almost instantaneously, and it's like, what? Okay, I mean, I knew this because of Gerard's review, but I did not realize how far deep this went, and that technically, you still don't even fight remotely half of them. You still fight, I lost count, but I believe it's over 10 technical bosses. So it's like, okay, and here's the bad thing, I'm not saying the game is bad, but the boss demonstrations on their own were half and half, I feel. The bosses themselves was a little bit half and half. So for example, you know, when you first start off, you know, you first have the tutorial boss, and naturally he's supposed to be a little bit easy because it is a tutorial. But unfortunately after that, it still gets a little bit on the unusual side, you know. The next rank, while yes a little bit overwhelming, it wasn't that bad of a boss. If nothing else, I found him quite interesting regardless, but he wasn't as difficult and challenging. Now, record, I get the understanding that technically this isn't supposed to be a difficult game like Dark Souls and stuff, but I was playing it on mild ending, the normal mode rather per se, and it's like, okay, so it's not easy, but yet I'm in normal, yet this feels somewhat easy, especially considering that most of these bosses, while yes they were overpowering, they wasn't difficult to fight. Even the giant robot thing, which was a different mode entirely, it didn't feel difficult. It just felt like, you know, I was dealing with heavy punches after heavy punch, but I was having to deal with regular attacks, just trying to push him back and stuff. Then after that, we go into another transition of a somewhat interesting, but yet not really difficult boss. The bosses felt like, you know, I could just attack him head on and not have any consequences, you know. In No More Heroes, you had to be strategic, but you had to be patient and wait for your opponent's moves in order to understand, okay, how am I going to fight this opponent, you know? How am I going to deal with it? The opponents up until, like, rank 23 wasn't really that. It was more or less like, okay, I can just charge into them, keep slashing my sword, and eventually they'll die. That's what it felt like the entire time. I felt like that was the only motion that I was doing, was just running into them and attacking. And I get that because of the fact that technically this was made for the Wii, but technically the first one did pretty well when it came to, like, not feeling like that was the only thing you were doing. You actually had to plan out your attacks before you can remotely attack them, because sometimes some enemies don't receive damage normally. You have to wait until a certain moveset comes up and then you can attack them. You know, that was a nice strategy, but in the first set of bosses, it didn't feel like that. It felt like you could just run into them and just slash your sword continuously. By the time it got to rank 23, that's when things started to shift into gear into a better performance of bosses, in my personal opinion. In fact, we still had a couple of bosses where they didn't really work well, but then you had some bosses that really stood out to me. For example, rank 23 stood out pretty well as an interesting boss, and then rank 22 after that. But then it got to an abnormal setup, because you went from, like, killing 1 or 2, and then all of a sudden you jump from, like, 20 to all of a sudden 10, almost instantaneously. And I'm like, what happened? What happened here? Where's my other kills? You know? And it seems weird. But then we transition into Shibuya, who happens to be that Asian girl that you technically fought and cut her hand off in the first one. She apparently thinks in her mind that she's an apprentice to Travis, and Travis is the master. Of course, Travis, being his self, is not pleased by this, but whatever. Apparently, you play as Shibuya for a while, and you kill 2 bosses with her. On the one hand, I was interested with this, but at the same time, I did not like the platforming. Technically, Travis does not jump at all in-game, yet when you play as Shibuya, all of a sudden you're doing platforming, and I was like, okay, this is odd. This is a weird thing. And it's like, it does this in like 3 or 4 separate things. Out of those 4, 3 of them didn't really work very well, in my personal opinion, you know. In one case, you're having to jump onto platforms in order to turn off these security lasers in order to proceed on to the next room and stuff. And then the other 2 are actual boss fights and everything. And while they are genuine ideal, they didn't work well in this case, in my personal opinion. The platforming did not work very well. I felt like the platforming could have done a little bit better. Then again, it could be from the transition from the Wii to the Switch. Could be that, I don't know. But as far as I know, I felt a little problematic when it came to the platforming in both cases. Then again, the bosses were okay. They wasn't fantastic, much like how I was saying before. They weren't something that stated that you had to be strategic. Even though one of them I did have a little bit of difficult time trying to kill. Not that it was overpowering, just that it took forever before I finally got to kill him. Then we kill a couple more assassins with Travis, and one of them was whenever I first discovered the first official bug with this game. Now again, it could be because of the transition from the Wii to the Switch perhaps, I'm not sure. But I had problem using the bike. Now technically in No More Heroes 2, you don't really use the bike heavily, you're more or less using a menu in order to traverse the overlay and stuff. But you do actually use the bike at some point in time. You know, you at least use it twice in the game. And out of those 2 times, I had trouble using the bike per se. There was a problem where I was trying to use the bike, but every single time I moved the direction or did anything differently aside from gas, it would just rev up the bike. It wouldn't move forward, so I was having so much trouble trying to get it to work. And it wasn't until I got to the second bike mission thing where if I stopped it long enough and then reversed back and then went forward again was whenever the controls reverted back to normal. And I feel like it's as if either this was a problem to begin with, or it was a problem that just resolved, that became a problem on the Switch version, but I felt like the bike thing was still a little bit haphazard, and it was a little bit of annoying, unfortunately. But that's not to say that I didn't enjoy the game on its own, you know. Again, like I said, most of the bosses were half and half. While half of them I didn't care much for, there was a good amount of bosses that I had so much fun with. For example, the one recognizable boss that I wanted to get into so badly was the 5th ranked boss. And the reason why was because I was so familiar with the Requiem that was sung in the technical Japanese version. In America, whenever it was released for the Wii, for some reason we had an alternative rock version, I suppose you could say? It did not sound right, but then when I heard the Japanese version, I really enjoyed that. In fact, even though I've never played Desperate Struggles, I had that on my MP3 player anytime I had the chance. I love that version of the song. And now that I finally played the Switch version of No More Heroes 2, that version was in it. That made me happy. I was like, oh yes, this is the version. This is the version I wanted to hear. And it sounds really nice to hear that version in this game. It was really nice. But not only that, but the boss was actually interesting too. The way that you actually had to proceed on to fight her. And it was actually interesting. Again, she's actually one of the few bosses that I would actually say she proposed an actual boss. She wasn't just like a giant meat shield that you had to strike down in order to bring down. No, she was an actual threat that you had to fight. You know, she was... Again, I had to tell you this, but there are certain bosses that I would pick out and be like, okay, these are the bosses that I would love to just carry on over to the other one and forget everything else, because they're not really worth their time, really, to be perfectly honest. But these particular bosses, they stood out the most to me when it comes to, like, being a better boss, a better performing boss. There were some others that were like, okay, this is interesting, or they were like, this is fine. And then there was one that I was like, okay, could we just, can you just die already? This is kind of getting boring here. But then again, you know, when you're trying to come up with the concept of, like, killing 50 assassins, that's kind of hard to do, you know. But at the same time, it didn't feel like the normal tradition of No More Heroes 1, where you were, like, killing all of the assassins in a row. It felt like you were jumping back and forth between what you were trying to do versus what's going on around Travis. Everything else that's going around Travis, everything is happening. But aside from that, again, the bosses were okay. They wasn't like stupendous compared to the first one. The first one I feel like did better when it came to the bosses. Not to say that this one has some good bosses, it does have some good ones, but there were some that wasn't that good. Now let's talk about the main game itself, the main game in which where, you're doing everything else, from either your apartment, doing jobs and stuff and everything like that, the main hub itself. In Travis's apartment, you can do a few things, next to saving, of course. You can play with Jean, who happens to be the cat who has gotten fat. Gotten fat? Little fat cat? And the cool thing is, though, once you slim Jin down, you learn a new technique, of course. But it was really nice. I kind of like it, I do like it. I still like whenever games, you can choose to do these side things and stuff. And it kind of gives you a little deviances when it comes to, like, doing the main quest versus doing smaller stuff and everything like that. But aside from that, though, in the game, while you're traveling into these different areas and stuff, whenever you're fighting different assassins and different targets and stuff, you do collect stuff. And these collectibles do appear in your apartment. It's not just like trading cards or stuff like that. No, these are actual objects that appear in the apartment itself. And as you're collecting them, they kind of grow more and more and more. To a point where I started to actually take a look around a little bit more, because I noticed, I was like, wait a minute, that wasn't there before. And as I kept finding more and more items, the more and more fuller the apartment became. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. And it kind of makes hunting down these other collectibles more worthwhile, In the first one, whenever you were hunting down Jesses and stuff, you had 3 chances. You had either health, battery, or these trading cards. In this game case, not only do you do the health, the battery, and of course these collectibles could be one of 2 things. Either one, they end up being collectibles for this anime/game series that Travis gets into. If you don't know, in the first one, he wears this shirt where it has these 3 young girls, and in this case, it's now 5 young girls. But in another case, though, these other collectibles actually ends up being part of the Assassination Association group. And you actually have what you would call trophies of the previous assassins that you've killed. And I actually like it. It's actually really, it's a nice detail that I like. It's one of those things where it's like, it's well worth actually collecting these chests, Even if it's a health or a battery, you still get a lot of different collectibles that kind of fill up the apartment. And I hope that carries over in the third one. I hope that carries over, because I actually kind of like that. That kind of gives it that in-depth of collectible that you want to collect for. But then, of course, outside the apartment, what else do you do? Well, you can do the variety of jobs that you have in your access, which I kind of like them. I mean, not all of them are the same way. One of them is slightly different. But for the majority of them, they're all this retro-style mini-game. You have sucking bugs, or moving pipes, flipping stakes and all that stuff. Most of them, much like the bosses, most of the jobs, I like them pretty well. Most of these are pretty fun to interact with. If nothing else, they're very entertaining to do. But then there's some that I can go, I don't really care much for this one, so I'll just pass on this one. I'll pass on this one, pass on this one. And I was like, you know what, let's just go ahead and just do the ones that I enjoy the most. I'll do the ones that I enjoy the most, the most, and just do those over and over and over again, because these are fun. These are games that I would be like, yeah, I'll play them a dozen times, it's not going to hurt me and all that stuff. I do actually like the fact that you don't actually have to use the money to pay for each individual assassination kill. I do like that, even though the game does kind of point out that you have to pay for a bus fare or something. But the reality is, you don't pay any money at all to proceed on through the story, which is nice. I do love that. Instead, the money is only used to purchase new weapons from Naomi's lab, to purchasing new outfits in Airport 51, and then of course, whenever you're training Travis. And I'm going to go into that actually, because The training is actually much like how you do the jobs. It has its own separate minigames, you know, one for attack and one for stamina. However, though, it got really hard. They got really hard as you continue further and further and further. They got more challenging. And so that's why I was saying before of how the bosses felt like you were just charging into them and then striking them down and stuff. I eventually decided to stop doing training entirely because of how difficult they were getting to be. And I thought to myself, okay, let's just play through the game from here on out. Let's not worry about doing the training, and instead let's just concentrate more on doing the main story and everything like that. Let's just see how far I can get without training. And the cool thing is this, you don't necessarily have to train that much just to proceed on through the main game. And I like that. I like how you don't necessarily have to do that. I mean, technically you kinda don't have to in the first one. You know, if you really didn't want to, you don't have to. It's not a big deal, but it's one of those things where it's like, I felt like you kinda needed to because it did actually help to a certain degree. Whereas in the second one, the training wasn't really necessary because the bosses were a little bit easy to begin with, and as they were continually being more and more of a challenge, I enjoyed it that much more. So I thought to myself, I was like, unless I started to lose health ridiculously fast, then I might try to do the treadmill training, because I could do the treadmill training pretty somewhat okay, even though it was getting a little bit harder and harder. The actual strength training though, oh dear God almighty, that takes some serious concentration that I couldn't even possibly do. I was like, oh my gosh, that's actually really challenging for me right there. That's really difficult. And then of course, aside from all that, you also have these revenge missions that you eventually get into later on in the game. And these revenge missions sort of takes like the assassination missions that you did in the first one, except they're more towards about the main story process. And I did all of them, and they were actually really fun. I did like these pretty well, you know. Again, they sort of take place during the same story process that was going on in the main game. But again, you don't have to do them. They're just a side option that you can take on later on in the game. So, what do I think about No More Heroes 2 now that I finally have dived into it and everything like that? Well, I'm a little bit mixed on it, considering the fact that technically I love the first one. I love the first one near and dear. And I love the improvements that the Switch version had made to make the game feel that much better. Playing the second one, though, there were definitely some things that I had problems with, you know. Problems that, while there was subtle improvements, there were some that could have done better. For example, either it was the controls on the bike, again, it could have been a bug, it could have been something that was problematic, but it was still an issue that I had. And then, of course, you also have the fact that half the bosses are not really something to write poetry on, where there was a good handful of bosses that I could say that I would love to play through again. There were other bosses that I can go, this wasn't a really good boss, really, in all honesty. But it's like, you know, it kind of makes sense that you can't really do every boss a masterpiece. You just have to, like, make them abnormally insane and try to make them unique, you know. Whatever makes them stand out into the player's minds as a pinnacle boss, that's what you just gotta do. Even if it means having one assassin with 24 other assassins team up together to join a giant robot. Even if it's as haphazard and as crazy as that, at least for the most part, everything else kind of works well to a certain degree. You know, again, if you've been familiar with Pseudos51's work, you'll know that he's just as insane and as crazy as every other game that he's ever done. So, this wasn't anything different, but it was definitely fun to kind of interact with regardless. But for the most part, the bosses that I did interact with the most, I had the most fun with. But overall, the second one is not better than the first one, but I can see why some people liked it a little bit better than the first one. It feels like the second one had a lot of improvements that makes it better. But again, I would stick with the first one because of the overall balance that it has throughout the entire game. Whereas the sequel, while yes, there was a lot of good stuff, there was a lot of negative stuff that I felt like kind of reduced it a little bit more. We're going to do a two-sided rating, because technically this is two separate games in terms of downloading. You know, each game is $15, $30 in total. The first one, of course, I would give it a 5 out of 5 because of me loving the game. But then The second one, I give it a 3 because, again, unless you are a fan of the second one does have a few little problems that I have, and again, the bosses are not nothing to write home about. While yes, the improvements definitely stand out, everything else kind of waters it down to a degree. So, first one, definitely a 5, second one, kind of a 3, so there you go on that one. But, overall, I'm glad that we have the Switch version to get into, because here's the thing. Again, I never played Desperate Struggles before, and before the Switch version, the only way you could play through Desperate Struggle was play it on the Wii version, and the Wii version is getting scarcely hard to come by, you know, unless you're an enthusiast of Wii games. I can honestly say that I'm glad that I didn't go out and hunt for the Wii version of Desperate Struggles, and instead I'm glad that I've waited as long as I did, and we have a console controller version of Desperate Struggles. So, while I still enjoy Desperate Struggles, it wasn't as great and fantastic as the first one was. So, there you go on that one. But, yeah, I just want to kind of give you my in-depth thoughts on what I thought about No More Heroes 2 Desperate Struggles, as well as give you a quick brief feel of what I thought about the Switch version for the first one. So it's like, while definitely get the Switch versions for both 1 and 2 if you wanted to get them, definitely grab both of them. But just to let you know, the second one probably isn't as good as what the first one was, in my personal opinion. Maybe for some others it might be a little bit different, but I felt like the second one was a little bit reduced to some degree. But anyway guys, thank you so much for watching. See you in the next video. Catch you guys later.